two families, same net worth, same decade, same country. Family A makes $40 million in a single, spectacular decade. A tech exit, a real estate windfall, a lucky IPO. They buy the house on the hill, the boat, the second and third homes, the private school tuition for kids who've never known anything else. By the third generation, the money is gone, not stolen, not lost to a crash, just spent, mismanaged, and divided into pieces too small to matter. Family B makes the same $40 million, but 100 years ago. And today, 4 generations later, that family doesn't just still have money. They have more of it, spread across foundations, family offices, private companies, and real estate portfolios that don't even show up in the wealth rankings, because the whole point was to become invisible. This isn't a story about luck. It's not really a story about investment returns either, because both families, statistically, had access to similar markets. This is a story about a mindset, a specific, learnable, transmissible way of thinking about money that has almost nothing to do with how much you have, and almost everything to do with how you think about what you have. Researchers have studied this exact phenomenon for decades under a phrase you may have heard before: shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. The saying exists in some form in nearly every culture on Earth. Lo que el padre gana, el nieto lo despana in Spanish. Rice paddies to rice paddies in Chinese proverb. Clogs to clogs in Lancashire. The consistency of the observation across cultures and centuries is itself the data point. Sudden wealth, without a mindset to hold it, evaporates on a strikingly predictable timeline. What we're doing today is dissecting the mindset itself, not the tax structures. We've covered those. Not the trusts. We've got a full video on that architecture. Today is the operating system underneath all of it, the actual beliefs, defaults, and decision-making patterns that separate a family that keeps its wealth for 1 generation from a family that keeps it for 5. This isn't hidden. It's just never taught. Section 1, the definition problem. Why old money isn't about money at all. Before we go further, we need to fix a mistake almost everyone makes when they hear the phrase old money mindset. They assume it's about frugality, or taste, or knowing which fork to use. It is none of those things, and treating it as etiquette is exactly why so many self-made fortunes fail to become family fortunes. The sociologist Pierre Bourdieu gave us the clearest framework for understanding what's actually going on, and it's one we return to often on this channel, because nothing explains old money behavior better. Bourdieu argued that capital doesn't come in one form. It comes in at least 3. Economic capital, the money itself. Cultural capital, knowledge, taste, credentials, the unspoken fluency in how elite institutions operate. And social capital, the actual network of relationships that can be mobilized for resources or opportunity. New wealth, almost by definition, arrives with economic capital alone. Someone builds a company, sells it, and suddenly has $30 million. But they don't yet have the cultural fluency of old money circles, and they don't have 3 generations of social capital built into boards, foundations, and marriages. The old money mindset is, at its core, a set of behaviors specifically engineered to convert economic capital into cultural and social capital, because those 2 forms are far stickier and far harder to lose in a single bad decade. Here's the mechanism in practice. A family that inherits money and spends it on visible consumption, cars, watches, a bigger house, is doing something Thorstein Veblen described over a century ago in his theory of conspicuous consumption. Veblen's insight was that once basic needs are met, spending becomes a signal, a way of broadcasting status to others. The problem is that conspicuous consumption is a one-way transaction. The money is gone, and what you're left with is a depreciating asset and a lifestyle cost basis that's now permanently higher. The old money mindset inverts this almost completely. Multi-generational families tend to spend on things Veblen wouldn't even categorize as consumption at all: education, professional networks, philanthropic positioning, family governance structures, and, critically, assets that are functionally invisible to outside observers. A shelf company holding a real estate portfolio doesn't impress anyone at a dinner party. That's the point. The wealth isn't meant to be seen, it's meant to be held. This produces what we might call the central paradox of the old money mindset. The families with the most money often look, from the outside, like they have less than they do. Meanwhile, families burning through new wealth often look, for a decade or two, like they have vastly more than they actually do. If you've ever wondered why the truly wealthiest people you've heard of often drive unremarkable cars and live in houses that would surprise you with their modesty, this is why. It's not thrift, it's architecture. There's a second piece of the definition problem worth addressing directly. Old money is not a bloodline claim, and treating it as one is both historically inaccurate and analytically useless. Every old money family was, at some point, new money. The Rockefellers were oil wildcatters in the 1860s. The Vanderbilts were steamship and railroad operators considered vulgar by the aristocratic families of their era. The Astors famously refused to receive them socially for decades. What separates a family that becomes old money from one that isn't when the fortune started. It's whether the mindset was installed before the third generation arrived. That's the entire ballgame, and it's why this video exists, because the mindset is learnable, structural, and, unlike a 200-year head start, something you can actually start building today. If this reframing is already changing how you think about wealth, not as a number, but as a system of behaviors, hit subscribe now, because the rest of this video breaks down exactly what those behaviors are, one mechanism at a time. We publish deep dives like this every week, and if you're the kind of person who wants to understand how the machinery actually works instead of just admiring the outcome, this is where that happens. Section 2. The Century Clock. How Time Horizon Rewires Every Decision. If there's one variable that predicts generational wealth survival better than any other, it's time horizon. And the old money mindset treats time horizon almost like a religious commitment. Ask a first-generation wealth creator what their investment horizon is, and you'll typically hear answers in years: 5 years until retirement, 10 years until the kid's college fund matures, maybe 20 if they are being unusually long-term. Ask someone raised inside a multi-generational family office the same question, and the honest answer is often, we're planning for people who haven't been born yet. This isn't poetic exaggeration, it's structural. Dynasty trusts, which we've covered in depth on this channel, are frequently built to run for the maximum duration state law allows, in some jurisdictions effectively perpetual. The economist Thomas Piketty's research on wealth concentration over centuries, most famously in his analysis of capital-to-income ratios stretching back to the 18th century, demonstrates something crucial. Wealth that compounds even modestly but consistently over a century behaves completely differently than wealth optimized for short-term maximum return. Here's what century-scale thinking does to actual decision-making, mechanism by mechanism. First, It changes risk tolerance in a counterintuitive direction. You'd expect a family sitting on $200 million to take more risk than a family with $2 million because they can absorb more loss. In practice, multi-generational families often take dramatically less portfolio risk than first-generation wealth because the goal isn't maximizing this generation's returns. It's minimizing the probability of catastrophic loss across every future generation. A 40% drawdown that a hedge fund chasing newly wealthy family might shrug off as part of the ride is treated, in dynastic wealth planning, as a near existential threat to the entire multi-century project. This is why old money portfolios are disproportionately weighted toward capital preservation vehicles, diversified real assets, and, as we covered in our video on the asset classes old money actually favors, things that don't move fast in either direction. Second, century thinking changes how families evaluate people, not just assets. When you're optimizing for a multi-generational outcome, you're not hiring a financial advisor for this decade. You're building an institutional relationship meant to outlast the people currently managing it. This is part of why family offices exist at all. A single family office isn't just a wealth management convenience. It's an attempt to build an institution with continuity independent of any one family member's lifespan. The Rockefeller family office, formally established in the early 20th century, is often cited as the template for this model precisely because it was designed from the outset to survive well past the founder. Third, and this is the piece most people miss entirely, century thinking changes what counts as success. A first-generation wealth creator measures success by portfolio growth this year. A family operating on a century clock measures success by whether the structure survives intact to the next generation at all, sometimes even if that means accepting lower absolute returns. This single reframe explains an enormous amount of behavior that otherwise looks irrational. The preference for boring, liquid, diversified holdings over concentrated bets. The reluctance to let any one family member have unilateral control over major assets. The almost obsessive emphasis on governance documents and family constitutions, which we've explored in a previous video, designed to bind decision-making even after the people who wrote the rules are gone. There's a psychological dimension here too, and it's worth naming directly because it's uncomfortable. Century-scale thinking requires a kind of ego dissolution that runs against almost everything in modern wealth-building culture. The wealth isn't yours in the way a self-made fortune feels like it belongs to its creator. It's held in trust, legally and psychologically, for people you'll never meet. Families that successfully install this mindset in their heirs report doing so deliberately and early, often before the heir has any real concept of what the family's actual net worth even is. We touched on this in our video on preparing heirs before 18. The mindset installation happens years, sometimes decades, before the money itself is ever discussed in concrete terms. Section 3. The invisible portfolio, cultural and social capital. As appreciating assets. Let's get concrete about what cultural and social capital actually look like when they're being deliberately built. Because old money families have connections is true, but almost useless as an explanation. The mechanism matters. Cultural capital, in Bourdieu's framework, comes in three forms worth distinguishing. There's embodied cultural capital, the dispositions, mannerisms, and unconscious competencies a person carries, often absorbed through upbringing rather than taught explicitly. There's objectified cultural capital, physical goods that carry cultural meaning, art collections, rare books, specific kinds of property. And there's institutionalized cultural capital, formal credentials, particularly ones that carry prestige disproportionate to their practical content, like membership in specific institutions or degrees from specific universities. The old money mindset treats all three as investable assets, not lifestyle accessories. This is the crucial distinction. A newly wealthy family might buy art because they like it, or because an advisor told them it diversifies a portfolio. An old money family treats an art collection as a multi-generational cultural capital position, something that will be donated strategically, loaned to museums under the family name, and used to build institutional relationships with cultural boards that, decades later, translate into social capital for grandchildren who've never even seen the original paintings. We covered the mechanics of this in our video on freeports and untaxed art storage. The art itself is often almost incidental to the actual financial and social engineering happening around it. Education works the same way, and this is where the embodied and institutionalized forms of cultural capital merge most visibly. It's not about getting into a good school for the sake of a good job. That's the first-generation framing. It's about the specific schools that function as social capital incubators, where the value isn't primarily the curriculum, but the 30 years of relationships that begin in a dormitory hallway. Sociologist Mark Granovetter's research on social networks gives us useful language here. He distinguished between strong ties, close relationships like family, and weak ties, looser acquaintance networks, and demonstrated that weak ties are often more valuable for accessing new information, opportunities, and resources precisely because they connect you to circles your strong ties don't already touch. Elite educational institutions are, functionally, weak tie manufacturing machines. And old money families understand this as literally as they understand compound interest. Social capital compounds in a way that's structurally similar to financial capital. And this comparison isn't just a metaphor. It's the actual mental model multi-generational families use. A relationship cultivated with a museum board, a hospital foundation, or a university endowment committee doesn't pay off in year one. It pays off when a grandchild needs a reference, when a family business needs a favorable regulatory relationship, or when a foundation needs credibility, partners for a major initiative 20 years down the line. Old money families invest in these relationships the way they'd invest in a bond ladder, consistently, patiently, across every available touchpoint, expecting the return decades out rather than next quarter. Philanthropy deserves particular attention here because it sits at the intersection of all three capital types simultaneously, and it's frequently misunderstood as pure altruism or pure tax strategy when it's actually neither in isolation. Strategic, often anonymous philanthropy, which we've explored on this channel before, builds cultural capital, association with respected causes, social capital, relationships with fellow donors and institutional boards, and, yes, tax efficiency, all in a single structure. But the mindset difference is this. A newly wealthy donor often gives visibly, attaching their name prominently, seeking recognition now. The old money approach frequently prioritizes structural, sustained giving, endowed positions, multi-year pledges, sometimes deliberately anonymous, because the goal is institutional embedding across decades, not a single moment of public credit. None of these mechanisms are conspiratorial. Every single one is legal, well documented, and available in principle to anyone who understands the architecture. That's the through line of this entire channel. This isn't a hidden cabal pulling strings. It's a set of legal mechanisms and behavioral patterns that happen to be poorly understood outside a small number of families who learned them by necessity. We've done a full breakdown of the anonymous philanthropy structures mentioned here. The actual legal vehicles families use to give strategically while staying off the public record. And it connects directly to what we're about to cover next. If you want the deeper mechanism, that video is linked in the card right now and in the description below. Section 4, the financial architecture. How the mindset gets encoded into structure. Mindset without mechanism is just philosophy. What separates families who successfully transmit generational wealth from families who simply talk about long-term thinking is that the mindset gets translated into concrete legal and financial structures early, structures that outlast the willpower of any single heir. This is worth dwelling on because it's the piece most content in this space skips entirely. Human discipline is not a reliable long-term asset. Every generation contains at least one person who, given unrestricted access to capital, would deplete it through bad investments, addiction, divorce, litigation, or simple overspending. Old money families don't solve this problem by hoping the next generation is more disciplined. They solve it by building structures that don't depend on discipline at all. The trust is the foundational tool here, and we've covered dynasty trust structures in detail previously, so we'll focus on the mindset dimension rather than repeating the mechanics. The key insight is this: a trust converts wealth preservation from a personal virtue into a structural default. An heir doesn't need to be disciplined about not liquidating the family real estate portfolio if the trust document simply doesn't give them the unilateral authority to do so. This is a profound psychological relief for many heirs. Incidentally, it removes them from the position of being solely responsible for not destroying a fortune built by people they never met. Family governance documents, family constitutions, in the terminology we've used before, extend this same logic beyond pure finance into decision-making itself. These documents typically codify things like how family members can access capital for business ventures, how disputes get resolved before they reach litigation, what standards heirs must meet before receiving distributions, sometimes tied to education, sometimes to demonstrated financial literacy, and how the family communicates about wealth across branches that may barely know each other by the fourth generation. The mindset encoded here is explicit. Assume future family members will not automatically share your values, and build the structure so the outcome doesn't depend on them doing so. Then there's the debt and liquidity architecture. Strategies like buy, borrow, die, which we've dedicated a full video to previously. The mindset underneath this strategy is worth isolating because it's genuinely counterintuitive to how most people think about debt. Conventional financial wisdom, absorbed by most first-generation wealth builders, treats debt as something to minimize and eliminate. The old money mindset treats strategic debt, specifically borrowing against appreciated assets rather than selling them, as a tool for avoiding capital gains realization while maintaining liquidity, with the debt itself often becoming a permanently rolled position across a lifetime and settled favorably at death under stepped-up basis rules. The point isn't the specific tax mechanism, it's the underlying belief system that liquidity and ownership are separable, and that a mindset obsessed with owning things outright is actually a less sophisticated position than one comfortable holding leveraged, professionally managed positions indefinitely. Shelf companies and holding structures, which we've also covered, serve a related but distinct mindset function, separating the visible legal owner of an asset from the beneficial owner for reasons that are overwhelmingly mundane: privacy, liability containment, estate planning efficiency, rather than the conspiratorial reasons often assumed. The mindset here is a discomfort with unnecessary visibility. A first-generation wealth holder often wants their name on the building, A multi-generational family frequently prefers the opposite: structural anonymity that reduces target risk, litigation risk, and social friction, even at the cost of public recognition. What ties all of these structures together is a single underlying principle worth stating plainly. The old money mindset does not trust any individual generation to preserve wealth through willpower alone, so it builds systems that preserve wealth through default settings instead. This is, in a sense, the entire secret. If you can call something secret when it's documented in estate law textbooks. The families who keep money for centuries aren't smarter or more disciplined than the families who lose it in one generation. They've simply built the discipline into the architecture, so it doesn't have to live inside any one fallible person. Section 5. The psychology of enough. Why old money families cultivate boredom. Here's a claim that sounds strange until you unpack it. One of the most reliable predictors of multi-generational wealth survival is a family's comfort with being bored. We explored this idea in a previous video on the value of boredom in wealth preservation, and it deserves a fuller psychological treatment here because it connects directly to everything we've covered about time horizon and risk tolerance. Excitement in a financial context is almost always correlated with risk, volatility, or spending. A hot stock tip, a flashy acquisition, a dramatic lifestyle upgrade. The old money mindset treats financial excitement not as a reward to chase, but as a warning signal to investigate. This produces genuinely counterintuitive behavior. Multi-generational families frequently maintain lifestyles that are, relative to their actual net worth, remarkably restrained, not out of miserliness, but because lifestyle inflation is one of the single most reliable ways wealth disappears across generations. Every dollar of recurring lifestyle spending isn't just that dollar spent once. It's an ongoing claim against the family's capital base, year after year, compounding in the wrong direction. Family that quietly decides its members will drive reasonably ordinary cars, live in houses that don't scream their net worth, and avoid the treadmill of keeping up with a peer group's spending, is making a structural decision as consequential as any trust document. There's a psychological framework worth introducing here that we haven't covered before on this channel. The concept of hedonic adaptation, well documented in behavioral psychology, which describes how humans rapidly adjust to improved circumstances and return to a relatively stable baseline of satisfaction, regardless of material gains. A yacht that feels thrilling in month 1 feels ordinary by month 18. And now the family is paying ongoing maintenance costs for an asset that no longer produces the emotional return that justified the purchase. Old money families, whether or not they'd use this exact terminology, seem to have absorbed this lesson institutionally. Visible consumption produces a rapidly depreciating emotional return alongside a very real financial one, and the mindset trains against chasing it. This connects to something we might call boring as a competitive advantage. In investment terms, this shows up as a preference for asset classes that don't generate dinner party stories, diversified index positions, unglamorous real assets, conservative fixed income, over the concentrated, exciting bets that make for good conversation but terrible multi-generational outcomes. The families who've held wealth across 5, 6, 7 generations are rarely the ones who took the most dramatic risks. They're overwhelmingly the ones who took the least unnecessary risk consistently enough, for long enough, that compounding did the rest of the work without drama. This same appetite for boredom extends into behavior around privacy, which we've discussed in the context of stealth wealth. Families comfortable operating below the radar aren't just protecting themselves from targeted litigation or kidnapping risk. though those are real considerations addressed at length in our Stealth Wealth Audit video. They're also protecting themselves from a subtler danger, the social pressure that visibility creates to spend, perform, and compete conspicuously with peers who can see what they have. Invisibility isn't just a security strategy. It's a psychological firewall against exactly the kind of status competition Veblen described. Because you cannot be drawn into a status game that other people don't know you're eligible to play. I want to hear from you directly on this one. Does the idea of deliberately choosing a boring lifestyle, despite having the means to live conspicuously, sound like discipline to you? Or does it sound like something else entirely? Maybe even its own kind of loss? Drop your take in the comments below. I read every single one, and some of the most interesting counter-arguments on this channel have come directly from that comment section, so don't hold back. Section 6. Transmission. How the mindset actually gets taught. Everything we've covered so far describes what the old money mindset consists of. This section addresses the question almost nobody answers clearly. How does it actually get transferred from one generation to the next, given that it's almost never taught through direct instruction? The uncomfortable truth is that most multi-generational families do not sit children down for formal lessons about wealth philosophy, at least not primarily. The mindset is transmitted the way most deep cultural knowledge is transmitted, through ambient exposure, modeled behavior, and a long apprenticeship that often doesn't even feel like education while it's happening. Consider how this plays out in practice. A child raised in a multi-generational wealth family typically doesn't learn about the family's actual net worth as a headline number. Often that number is deliberately obscured well into adulthood, a pattern we examined closely in our video on preparing heirs before 18. What the child absorbs instead is a set of behavioral defaults. How the family talks about spending decisions at the dinner table, how disagreements about money get resolved, or deliberately not discussed in front of children at all, what gets celebrated and what gets quietly disapproved of. A child who watches a parent decline an impulsive luxury purchase, or watches extended family members navigate a difficult inheritance conversation with restraint rather than conflict, is absorbing the mindset far more effectively than any lecture could achieve. This is where embodied cultural capital, in Bourdieu's terms, does its most important work. It's not information, it's disposition. And dispositions formed early through repeated exposure rather than instruction tend to feel like common sense, or just how our family is to the person who holds them, which makes the mindset remarkably durable. It doesn't feel like a rule being followed. It feels like an obvious truth. Formal transmission does happen too, and it's worth naming the mechanisms explicitly because they are genuinely replicable by families building this mindset from scratch. Family meetings, structured, sometimes annual or quarterly gatherings where financial education, governance updates, and family history are discussed collectively, are common in well-run multi-generational families and were the subject of a previous video on family meeting structures. These meetings often introduce younger family members to financial literacy incrementally, understanding a basic balance sheet before ever discussing the family's actual figures, learning how the family's philanthropic foundation makes decisions before being invited to participate in one, shadowing a family office meeting as an observer years before having any actual authority. There's also a deliberate practice, documented across many prominent families, of requiring younger members to build some form of independent competence, a career, a credential, sometimes a modest, independent business, before they're given significant access to family capital or governance authority. The mindset justification is explicit. Someone who has never had to earn anything is poorly positioned to understand the value of what they're protecting. This connects to what we discussed in our video on why some heirs actively reject inherited wealth, a pattern that researchers link, at least in part, to heirs who received access to capital without ever developing the competence or identity to feel they'd earned any standing to manage it. Finally, transmission includes something we might call narrative infrastructure. The family stories, deliberately or semi-deliberately preserved and retold, about how the fortune was built, what mistakes were made along the way, and what values the family considers non-negotiable. These stories function almost like an oral legal code. They're not binding in the way a trust document is, but they carry enormous behavioral weight precisely because they're transmitted emotionally rather than administratively. A story about a great-grandparent's near-catastrophic financial mistake, retold at every family gathering, does more to install risk discipline in a 12-year-old than any spreadsheet ever could. Section 7. The failure mode. Where even good structures break down. We'd be doing this topic a disservice if we ended on a purely admiring note, because the old money mindset, for all its sophistication, fails constantly. Understanding why it fails is at least as instructive as understanding why it succeeds, and it's the piece almost nobody covers honestly. Let's return to that shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves pattern from the cold open. The specific attrition statistics vary considerably by source and methodology, and figures in the 70 to 90% range circulating in popular media should be treated as contested rather than precisely established. Different studies define family wealth differently, track different time horizons, and use different criteria for what counts as loss. What's much better supported across the research is the directional pattern. Multi-generational wealth attrition is common, and the mechanisms behind it are fairly consistent, even if the exact percentage isn't settled science. So, what actually breaks the mindset, even in families that seem to have built the right structures? The first failure mode is structural over-reliance without genuine buy-in. A trust or governance document can restrain behavior, but it cannot install belief. Families that build sophisticated legal architecture without genuinely transmitting the underlying mindset often produce heirs who experience the structure as an obstacle to be resented or circumvented, rather than a tool they understand and value. Litigation between trust beneficiaries and trustees, disputes over discretionary distributions, and outright legal challenges to trust terms are not rare. They're a predictable outcome when structure substitutes for genuine understanding rather than reinforcing it. The second failure mode is the black sheep problem, which we've explored directly in a previous video. Every large family, across enough generations, produces at least one member whose values, choices, or life path diverge sharply from the family's wealth preservation culture. How a family handles that divergence, with rigid exclusion, or with some form of accommodation that keeps the person inside the family's social and informational network, even while disagreeing on values, turns out to matter enormously for long-term cohesion. Families that handle this poorly often find that the black sheep becomes a source of leaked information, public conflict, or litigation that damages the broader family's privacy and stability. The third failure mode is simply success itself, compounding past the point the original structures anticipated. A family constitution written for a family of 12 becomes unwieldy for a family of 200, spread across continents, many of whom have never met each other. Family capital that once flowed through a handful of close relationships now has to be governed across branches with genuinely divergent interests, and the informal, relationship-based trust that made early governance work simply doesn't scale the same way. This is one of the least discussed failure modes precisely because it looks like success right up until it isn't. The family grew, the wealth grew, and somewhere in that growth, the cohesion that made the whole system function quietly came apart. The fourth, and perhaps most human failure mode, is a slow drift in what enough means. The psychology of the wealth ceiling we explored in an earlier video. Families that successfully preserve wealth across generations sometimes find that the very success of the mindset produces a kind of complacency in later generations, who never experienced scarcity, never watched the fortune nearly disappear, and therefore never developed the visceral caution that drove the original wealth preservation behavior in the first place. The mindset, in other words, can decay simply because it worked too well for too long, insulating later generations from the conditions that made the mindset feel necessary. None of this is presented as fatalism. It's presented because an honest account of the old money mindset has to include its failure points, not just its successes. And because families actively building this kind of structure today are far better served by understanding where it tends to break than by assuming the mechanics alone are sufficient. If you've made it this far, you understand this mindset in more depth than most people who write about wealth for a living. So if this video earned it, tap the like button now. It's the single biggest factor in whether YouTube shows this kind of long-form, research-heavy content to more people who'd actually value it, and it costs you nothing. So what is the old money mindset? Stripped down to its essence, it's a time horizon measured in centuries rather than years. It's a willingness to convert visible economic capital into far stickier and far less visible cultural and social capital. It's a preference for structural discipline over personal willpower, because willpower is not a reliable multi-generational asset. It's a genuine comfort with boredom, privacy, and restraint in a culture that constantly rewards the opposite. And it's a transmission process that happens far more through modeled behavior and lived exposure than through any single lecture or document. None of it is secret in the sense of being hidden by conspiracy. It's published in estate law journals, sociology textbooks, and family office white papers that almost nobody outside the industry ever reads. The families who've held wealth across 5 or 6 generations aren't smarter than everyone else, and they didn't get luckier with their investments in any consistent, measurable way. They simply absorbed, deliberately or by ambient exposure, a set of beliefs about time, visibility, and structure that most people never encounter, because most people never have a reason to go looking for them. This isn't hidden, it's just never taught. If today's video gave you the why behind generational wealth, next week we're going deeper into the how, the specific governance mechanisms multi-generational families use to keep 200 relatives who've never met from tearing the whole structure apart. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss it, and if there's a specific mechanism from today's video you want a full dedicated breakdown of the family constitutions, the century clock investment approach, anything, tell me in the comments. This channel is built directly from what you ask to understand next.